Today we're going to talk about the muscular system, specifically skeletal muscles. Body movements such as walking, talking, chewing food, circulating blood, and digesting food depend on the actions of the muscles. Individual muscle fibers are surrounded by a connective tissue covering called the endomysium. The muscle fibers are arranged in pairs called fascicles. Each fascicle is wrapped by connective tissue, which is called the perimysium. The muscle is surrounded by a covering of connective tissue called the epimysium. Skeletal muscles are voluntary muscles that are attached to bones. There are 600 skeletal muscles. Each skeletal muscle is made up of hundreds, sometimes thousands, of muscle cells referred to as muscle fibers. Each skeletal muscle has a nerve supply and a system of blood vessels that supply it with nutrients and oxygen and carry away wastes. The epimysium, perimysium, and endomysium are continuous with one another. Extension of epimysium form tendons, the tough cords of connective tissue that anchor muscles to bones. The muscle is surrounded by a fibrous connective tissue called fascia that merges with the tissues of the tendon. Individual muscle fibers are surrounded by a connective tissue covering, the endomysium. Each fascicle, or one bundle of a muscle, is wrapped by connective tissue, the perimysium. The muscle is surrounded by a covering of connective tissue called the epimysium. Muscles are specialized for contraction. Myosin and actin are contractile proteins. Motor nerves signal muscles to contract. Each skeletal muscle fiber is a spindle-shaped cell with many nuclei and with numerous mitochondria that provide energy for muscle contraction. The plasma membrane has many inward extensions that form a set of transverse tubules, otherwise known as T-tubules. Each muscle fiber is almost filled with thread-like structures called myofibrils that run lengthwise through the muscle fiber. The myofibrils are composed of even smaller structures called muscle filaments that are made of protein threads. There are two types of muscle filaments. Thick filaments called myosin filaments consist mainly of the protein myosin. Thin filaments called actin filaments consist of the protein actin. Myosin and actin are contractile proteins. They are capable of shortening. Myosin and actin filaments are characterized or organized into repeating units called sacromeres, the basic unit of muscle contraction. Hundreds of sacromeres connect end to end to make up a myofibril. Sacromeres are joined at their ends by interweaving filaments called the Z-line. Each sacromere consists of overlapping myosin and actin filaments. The filaments overlap lengthwise in the muscle fibers, producing the pattern of transverse bands or striations. A motor nerve is made up of motor neurons that transmit impulses to muscle fibers. Each motor neuron signals from 1 to several hundred muscle fibers. The junction of the neuron and muscle fiber is called a neuromuscular junction. A motor neuron releases the neurotransmitter acetylcholine, which is a signaling molecule. Neurotransmitters transmit signals across synapses, which are junctions between neurons. Acetylcholine is released into the synaptic cleft, the small space between the motor neuron and the muscle fiber. Acetylcholine diffuses across the synaptic cleft and combines with receptors on the muscle fiber. This causes depolarization, a decrease in the charge difference across the plasma membrane of a muscle fiber. Depolarization may cause an electrical impulse or action potential to be generated in the muscle fiber. Each extra acetylcholine is broken down by an enzyme called acetylcholinesterase. In a muscle fiber, an action potential is a wave of depolarization that travels along the plasma membrane and spreads through the T-tubules. Depolarization of the T-tubules triggers the release of stored calcium ions from the endoplasmic reticulum. calcium ions bind to a protein on the actin filament, causing it to change shape. The energy storage molecule, ATP, provides energy for muscle contraction. When the muscle is at rest, ATP is bound to the myosin. Then, when the binding sites are exposed, ATP is split. This reaction produces ADP. When ATP is split, energy is released and myosin is energized. The energized myosin attracts to the binding site on the actin filament, forming a cross bridge that links the myosin and actin filaments. The release of inorganic phosphate from the myosin causes the cross bridges to flex. This is the power stroke. The actin filament is pulled closer to the center of the sarcomere, shortening the muscle. ADP is released. A new ATP molecule binds to the myosin, and the myosin detaches from the actin filament. If sufficient calcium ions are available, the process is repeated. Muscle contraction requires energy. Creatine phosphate is the backup energy source for muscles. The energy for making creatine phosphate and ATP comes from fuel molecules such as glucose. Glucose is stored in muscle cells in the form of glycogen. The immediate source of energy for muscle contraction is ATP. However, large amounts of ATP cannot be stored. After the first few seconds of strenuous activity, the muscle uses up its supply of ATP. Muscles have a backup energy source compound called creatine phosphate. This compound can be stockpiled and its stored energy is transferred to ATP as needed. During vigorous exercise, muscle cells rapidly use up their supply of creatine phosphate. As ATP and creatine phosphate stores are depleted, muscle cells must replenish their supply of these high-energy compounds. The energy for making creatine phosphate and ATP comes from fuel molecules such as glucose. Glucose is stored in muscle cells in the form of large energy storage molecules called glycogen. As needed, glycogen is degraded, yielding glucose, which is then broken down in cellular respiration. When enough oxygen is available, energy is captured from the glucose to produce needed quantities of ATP, and creatine phosphate are produced. During strenuous exercise, there may not be enough oxygen available to meet the needs of muscle cells. Under these conditions, muscle cells are capable of breaking down fuel anaerobically or without oxygen for short periods. This does not yield much ATP. The depletion of ATP results in weaker contractions and muscle fatigue. A waste product called lactic acid is produced during anaerobic metabolism of glucose. Lactic acid buildup contributes to muscle fatigue. Isotonic versus isometric contractions. Contractions that involve the shortening of the muscle are referred to as isotonic contractions. For instance, when you lift a heavy object or bend your elbow, muscles shorten and thicken as they contract. Muscle tone remains the same. The picture at the bottom demonstrates isotonic contraction. In contrast, isometric contraction is when the muscle tension increases, but the muscle length does not change. So for instance, a heavy table or a wall does not move if you push against it. Muscle tension increases greatly, but the muscle length does not change. When in isometric contraction, a muscle won't be able to lift a weight. Muscles work antagonistically to one another. Muscles can only pull, they cannot push. Skeletal muscles produce movements by pulling on tendons, which in turn pull on bones. When you flex your elbow, your bicep muscle contracts, pulling the radius upwards so that you can touch your shoulder. Your bicep cannot push your radius back down. To move your forearm down again, the tricep muscle contracts, pulling the ulna. Thus, the bicep and triceps work antagonistically. When the agonist is moving, the antagonist is relaxed. Generally, movements are accomplished by groups of muscles working together, so several agonists and several antagonists may take part in the action. Synergists stabilize joints so that an undesirable movement doesn't occur. So the origin is the attachment of the muscle to the less movable bone. The insertion is the attachment of the muscle to a more movable bone. An agonist is the muscle that contracts to produce a particular action. The antagonist is the muscle that produces the opposite movement of the agonist. And then synergists are muscles that help the agonist by reducing unnecessary movement. This slide shows a picture of various muscles throughout the body. And this is a posterior view of various muscles throughout the body.